Netflix's most profitable move of the last decade wasn't a hit show. It was telling millions of people they couldn't share a password anymore and watching subscriber numbers go up instead of down. That single decision, one that every basic business intuition says should have driven customers straight to a competitor, tells you almost everything about how strange this business actually is underneath the surface. You think you're paying Netflix for movies and shows. What you're actually paying for is the right to not think about what to watch. And it turns out that's worth a lot more than anyone expected, including, for a long time, Netflix itself. Start with the part almost nobody prices correctly when they imagine owning a streaming service. Content isn't a product you sell once. It's a product you have to keep buying forever at a scale that gets more expensive every single year. In 2023 alone, Netflix spent roughly $17 billion on content, an amount that doesn't build anything permanent because the subscriber isn't paying for the show they watched last year. They're paying for what's new this month, and if that pipeline ever runs dry, the subscription stops making sense within weeks, not years. Compare that to a company that owns a factory or a patent. The asset sits there and keeps generating value with no new spending required. Netflix's entire library is closer to a leaky bucket that has to be refilled constantly just to stay at the same water level. That leaky bucket problem is exactly why the company's early strategy looked almost suicidal from the outside. Starting in 2013 with House of Cards, Netflix began pouring money into original content it owned outright, instead of just licensing shows from networks like it had for years. The logic seemed backwards. Why spend billions making your own content when you could keep renting someone else's for less? The answer showed up a few years later when Disney, Warner Bros., and NBC Universal all realized streaming was the future and pulled their own shows off Netflix to launch Disney Plus, Max, and Peacock. Every dollar Netflix had spent building its own library in advance was a dollar of leverage it didn't have to beg another studio for later. The company that looked like it was overspending on originals in 2013 was actually the only one not caught flat-footed when the entire industry turned into a war between platforms instead of a marketplace of channels. The scale of what was at stake becomes clearer once you look at what actually left the platform once other studios finally acted. Friends, one of the most rewatched shows in Netflix's history exited the platform at the end of 2019 when Warner Media pulled it to launch its own service, reportedly paying its own studio several $100 million just to keep the rights in-house rather than license them back out. The Office followed a similar path, leaving Netflix at the start of 2021 after NBC Universal reclaimed it to anchor its own streaming platform, in a deal reported to be worth even more. Both shows had spent years as some of the single most watched titles on the entire platform, not because Netflix produced them, but because it had simply rented the right to stream them. When that rent stopped being for sale, no amount of money could buy back the audience habit those two shows had already built somewhere else. That's the exact leverage problem the original content strategy from 2013 had been built to prevent. Here's where the business model gets genuinely strange, and it's the part almost no subscriber ever thinks about. Netflix has almost no idea, in any predictable way, which of its shows are actually going to work. Compare that to a toll bridge, where the exact same commute happens every single day, or a payment processor where transaction volume moves in smooth, forecastable curves. Content is nothing like that. Squid Game cost around $21 million to produce, a rounding error by Netflix's standards, and became the platform's most watched series ever, estimated by the company itself to have generated over $900 million in what they call impact value. Meanwhile, shows with budgets in the hundreds of millions have landed and vanished within weeks, barely denting the platform's numbers. There is no reliable formula that predicts which one you're building. The business runs on making enough bets across enough genres and countries that the portfolio works even when any single title is a coin flip. That's not an accident of storytelling. It's a deliberate portfolio strategy, and the enough countries part matters more than it sounds like it should. Squid Game wasn't an American production picked up for global release. It was a Korean show made primarily for a Korean audience that Netflix's own algorithm and marketing engine pushed in front of a worldwide audience who would likely have never found it otherwise. That's the advantage almost no traditional studio has. Netflix isn't betting on Hollywood. It's betting on Seoul, Madrid, Mumbai, and Copenhagen simultaneously, treating hits from any country as global inventory instead of regional content, which means a single breakout show in Korea or Spain like Money Heist effectively de-risks the entire content budget for that year in a way no single American market ever could alone. Netflix has backed that international bet with real money, not just marketing language. In 2023, the company announced a commitment of $2.5 billion specifically earmarked for Korean content production over the following 4 years, roughly double what it had spent in the country over the previous 4 combined. That is not the behavior of a company treating international content as a side experiment. It's the behavior of a company that watched one $21 million bet return on $900 million in value and decided the correct response was to make that same bet at that same scale permanent. Underneath all of that content spending sits an engine most subscribers never think about at all, the recommendation algorithm. Netflix has stated internally that the system influences a massive share of what gets watched on the platform, and the reason that number matters isn't technology flex, it's financial architecture. Every dollar spent on content is only valuable if the right subscriber actually finds that content and watches it. A brilliant, expensive show that nobody discovers is functionally the same as a show that was never made, except it's already cost the company tens of millions of dollars. The algorithm isn't a nice-to-have feature layered on top of the business. It's the mechanism that makes the $17 billion content bet actually pay off. By making sure spending on content and spending on discovery aren't two separate problems. They're the same problem solved by the same system. Now, for the number that actually determines whether any of this works, churn, the percentage of subscribers who cancel every month. This is the single most dangerous number in the entire business, more dangerous than any content flop. Because unlike a one-time bad show, churn compounds. A streaming service leaking 2% of its subscribers every single month doesn't just lose 2% of revenue. It has to spend on marketing and new content just to replace those lost subscribers before it can grow at all. Which means a high churn streaming service can spend a fortune on great content and still shrink, simply because the bucket is leaking faster than it's being filled. Netflix's obsession with personalization, with new releases dropping constantly instead of all at once, with entire seasons designed to hook you episode to episode, isn't really about storytelling craft. It's churn management dressed up as creative decision making. That vulnerability turned into an actual crisis in April of 2022, when Netflix reported losing around 200,000 subscribers in a single quarter. Its first subscriber decline in more than a decade. The stock dropped by roughly 35% in a single day of trading, wiping out tens of billions of dollars in market value. And by the time the year was over, the stock had fallen by more than 70% from where it started. The company that had spent a decade being treated as the untouchable pioneer of streaming was suddenly being talked about as a cautionary tale. Proof that the entire model, like endless content spending, funded by ever-growing subscriber counts, broke the moment subscriber growth stopped being guaranteed. Wall Street didn't just want a good quarter after that, it wanted proof that Netflix had a second lever to pull that didn't depend on convincing new people to sign up every single month. Which brings us back to the password sharing crackdown and why it actually worked when conventional wisdom said it should have backfired. Netflix estimated that over 100 million households worldwide were watching on borrowed accounts, using the service without paying for it directly. The naive fear was that cracking down would trigger a wave of cancellations from angry freeloaders and the people who'd been generously sharing with them. Instead, in the first quarter, after the policy rolled out broadly across the US in 2023, Netflix added nearly 6 million new paid subscribers, its best quarter of growth in years. The lesson wasn't that people love paying more, it was that the habit itself, already built into someone's evening routine for years, was worth more than the annoyance of a new fee. Netflix wasn't selling a login. It was selling a place in someone's routine that had already been running on autopilot for years, and routines, it turns out, are far stickier than password sharing ever was. That same insight that the real product is habit, not content library, is what pushed Netflix into advertising, a move the company spent nearly a decade publicly resisting. For years, executives argued that ads would cheapen the experience competitors like cable had trained audiences to escape from. Then, in the wake of that 2022 crisis, Netflix reversed course and launched an ad-supported tier at a lower price. Within about a year and a half, that tier had grown to over 40 million monthly active users, capturing an entirely different kind of customer. Someone who was never going to pay $15 or $20 a month, but was perfectly happy to watch the same shows with a few ad breaks for a third of the price. Netflix didn't just add a cheaper plan. It found a second revenue stream sitting inside the same subscriber base, monetizing attention it had previously been giving away as a customer acquisition cost. So if you're pricing what it actually takes to run something like Netflix, the honest answer is that you're not really in the entertainment business at all. You're running a portfolio of high-risk creative bets, funded by a subscription base that has to be constantly protected from churn, matched to content by an algorithm that has to work harder than any single show ever could, and defended against competitors who now control their own most valuable titles and no longer need you to distribute them. The technology, the interface, the app on your TV, that part was never the hard problem. The hard problem was building a machine that could keep placing thousands of unpredictable bets every single year and staying profitable even when most of those bets individually lose.